Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive right into the geopolitical calculations, the raw science, and the honestly chilling human reality behind the dawn of the atomic age. We're going to look at exactly how a grinding, relentless global conflict pushed humanity to literally unlock the power of the sun and the devastating consequences that followed. So let's just jump right in.
To really wrap our heads around this monumental shift in history, we're going to break this down into 5 parts. Global conflict to atomic race. The Manhattan Project succeeds, choosing the doomsday targets, dropping the atomic bombs, and finally, the unprecedented human reality.
Part 1. Global conflict to atomic race. Let's set the stage.
So think of this like a massive global domino effect. Decades of mounting tension pulled America into an absolutely unrelenting conflict. You go from a political assassination in Europe back in 1914 that sparks World War I, right up to the rise of Hitler invading Poland in 1939, and then by the time the Japanese launched their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the entire globe was just completely engulfed. The scale of warfare had expanded way beyond anything humanity had ever seen before.
Exhausted by these brutal, grinding battles across the Pacific, the United States military began searching for an absolute, permanent solution to force a Japanese surrender. The December 7th attack on Pearl Harbor left 2,403 Americans dead and essentially shattered the Pacific Fleet. This catapulted the U.S. into a grueling island-hopping campaign. We're talking Midway, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The casualties were just staggering, and Japan showed absolutely zero signs of backing down. The American leadership quickly realized they needed a trump card, something big, to avoid an even bloodier mainland invasion.
Which brings us to Part 2. The Manhattan Project succeeds.
Driven by this absolute, terrifying fear that Nazi Germany might get there first, scientists at Los Alamos worked round the clock to build a theoretical weapon of unimaginable power. Starting in 1942, the Manhattan Project became the most ambitious, secretive, industrial, and scientific endeavor in human history. Deep out in the mountains of New Mexico, the absolute greatest minds of the era were out there, literally wrestling with the building blocks of matter.
And then on July 16, 1945, it happened. The Trinity test unleashed 21 kilotons of energy, proving their plutonium device actually worked, and essentially turning the night desert sky into broad daylight. They nicknamed it the Gadget. This successful detonation fundamentally shifted the entire geopolitical landscape overnight. President Truman, who was actually at the Potsdam Conference meeting with Churchill and Stalin at the time, received a coded cable letting him know the test was successful beyond their wildest expectations.
Now, armed with this world-altering technology, the Allies issued a final, incredibly stark ultimatum to the Japanese leadership, promising unprecedented ruin if they didn't surrender. This was the famous Potsdam Declaration. It offered Japan a chance to surrender unconditionally without being enslaved. But the Japanese leadership, who were totally paralyzed by internal division and secretly hoping the Soviets would step in to mediate, well, they met the declaration with total silence. The die was officially cast.
Moving into Part 3, choosing the doomsday targets.
Now, what's truly fascinating, and a little chilling, is the incredibly cold, pragmatic criteria the military used to cross cities off their list until Hiroshima was the one remaining. Secretary of War Henry Stimson specifically removed Kyoto from the top of the list because he wanted to preserve its cultural significance for post-war reconciliation. Tokyo? Well, Tokyo was already essentially a ruin from months of conventional firebombing. But Hiroshima was highly populated, possessed a major military base, and critically, it was largely untouched.
The historical sources reveal that the desire to clearly gauge the weapon's physical effects heavily influenced the selection of an untouched metropolis. American scientists and military planners literally needed a pristine canvas to accurately measure exactly what an atomic blast would do to urban infrastructure and to human bodies. It was, in many ways, an unprecedented science experiment executed right in the middle of a total war.
And the military actually prepared 2 fundamentally different types of bombs for these strikes. Little Boy relied on firing a uranium projectile into a uranium target to trigger a chain reaction, while Fat Man was a far more complex implosion device using plutonium. There was actually a third design, Thin Man, but it got scrapped because it was prone to blowing up prematurely, which is terrifying. This technology was so impossibly new, they were essentially bringing 2 completely different physics experiments into the skies over Japan.
Let's look at Part 4, dropping the atomic bombs. At exactly 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, Little Boy was dropped by the B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay.
It detonated exactly 600 meters above Hiroshima to maximize the unstoppable chain reaction. And listen, this altitude wasn't a guess. Radar altimeters deliberately triggered the blast high above a surgical clinic to ensure the maximum possible reach of the overpressure shockwave and the thermal radiation before it hit the ground. In less than a microsecond, a man-made sun igniting. The resulting blast, the intense thermal radiation, and the massive subsequent fires pushed total casualties in Hiroshima to well over 140,000 people by the end of 1945. Think about that number. Nearly all reinforced concrete buildings within a 370-meter radius were just instantly vaporized. A massive firestorm engulfed the entire city. Shadows of human beings were permanently etched into the stone pavement. It's almost incomprehensible.
Then, 3 days later, the mission to drop the second bomb was plagued by a wild string of technical failures and bad weather, which actually saved the city of Kokura by pure chance. The bomber, named Boxcar, was missing 640 gallons of usable fuel right off the bat due to a pump failure. Their instrument planes completely missed the rendezvous, flying in the wrong patterns. And when they finally reached Kokura, workers at a nearby steel plant were intentionally bringing coal tar, creating this incredibly thick black smoke that totally hid the city. After 3 failed bombing runs flying through heavy anti-aircraft fire, they had to abort. This crazy string of events is still known today as Kokura's luck.
Dangerously low on fuel and abandoning Kokura, the crew turned to their secondary target, Nagasaki. They dropped the Fat Man bomb at 11:02 a.m. through a very brief opening in the clouds. I mean, they were so low on fuel at this point, they had actively debated just ditching the bomb into the ocean. But a tiny, sudden window in the weather sealed Nagasaki's fate. Yielding an even larger blast in Hiroshima, the bomb detonated over Nagasaki, killing roughly 75,000 people and finally forcing Japan's surrender. Combined with the massive Soviet invasion of Manchuria that had just launched a few hours prior, the Japanese emperor acknowledged the utter futility of resistance. On August 15th, World War II effectively ended, but the true, long-lasting cost of the atomic age was just beginning to be understood.
Which leads us to our final section, the unprecedented human reality.
See, physics dictates that survival during an atomic blast is just a cold, mathematical calculation of distance, heavily dependent on a strict 3-kilometer threshold. Inside this ring, the sheer energy density vaporizes organic matter, but right on that 3-kilometer line, the overpressure drops just enough to shatter your eardrums without liquefying your internal organs, and the thermal flash causes severe burns rather than instant incineration.
To understand this, you really have to consider the story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi. He walked out of the Hiroshima wasteland, heavily burned and deafened, seeking safety at his home in Nagasaki. He was a 29-year-old naval engineer who survived the initial blast purely because he was standing right on that 3-kilometer mathematical edge. Battered and in shock, he made a perfectly logical decision. He boarded a surviving train to get away from the destruction and return to his hometown for medical care. He had absolutely no idea he was traveling straight into a second ground zero.
In a statistical anomaly that is almost entirely unique to him, Yamaguchi found himself inside the 3-kilometer survival ring of a nuclear blast for the second time in 3 days. Despite his horrific burns and injuries, he was so dedicated that he actually reported to his shipyard office in Nagasaki on the morning of August 9th.
The utter disbelief of Yamaguchi's boss perfectly captures how impossible the destructive scale of the atomic age was for the human mind to process at the time. As Yamaguchi frantically tried to explain that a single flash of light had completely erased Hiroshima, his boss dismissed it. He said it was an absolute exaggeration, that it was impossible. And right as those words left his mouth, the window went blindingly white. The Fat Man detonated. Yamaguchi was thrown across the room, enduring the impossible physics of a nuclear shockwave twice in 1 week. He somehow survived, living for over 9 decades, and spent the rest of his life addressing the UN and the world as the ultimate living witness to nuclear war.
As we reflect on Tsutomu Yamaguchi's lifelong plea for nuclear disarmament, we have to ask ourselves if society today truly grasps the horrific reality of the atomic power we've unlocked. We can map out the military strategy, sure, and we can calculate the kilotons all day, but Yamaguchi's story reminds us that underneath all that data, there is a totally incomprehensible human toll. Are we really prepared to ensure that these weapons remain a relic of the past, or do we still harbor the exact same disbelief as Yamaguchi's supervisor? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.